as you can see, the stage setting here of how both government and businesses are starting to look at their leadership. I'm going to sit down with Katherine Hamilton and Jigar Shah in just a minute, and we're going to talk a little bit about the future and what the scene looks like. Katherine and Jigar are 2/3 of the energy gang. I'm going to be a poor representation of the last third of it. But if you're not familiar with them, they do a popular weekly podcast, and it's called The Energy Gang, and it's put on by Green Tech Media. And so after this is over, you should download those pods and podcasts and listen to them. Katherine is the head of 38 North, a public policy firm focused on clean energy and innovation. And before that, she ran Smart Grid-focused Gridwise Alliance. She was also a policy advisor for Good Energies, a private equity company with over $6 billion in a clean energy portfolio. And Jigar is the president and co-founder of Generate Capital. He was the founder and CEO of Sun Edison. He pioneered no money down solar, which unlocked a multi-billion-dollar solar market. And he was the founding CEO of the Carbon War Room, a global nonprofit that was founded by Sir Richard Branson. He's also the author of Creating Climate Wealth, Unlocking the Impact Economy. So Katherine and Jigar, maybe we get some more Timberlake here. Come on up. Fine. All right, so we have so much time and so much to cover. That's actually a lighthearted joke. So I think one of the things that's been apparent to all of us in this conference so far is the many transitions that are already underway. And I think we've talked about this a little bit. And you guys have sort of a front seat almost on a weekly basis, talking about one of the most, some of the most timely topics. I particularly enjoyed listening to you guys discuss the Green New Deal a couple of weeks ago. But from that porch that you're sitting on and the conversations you have with each other and who you talk to keep yourselves informed in your own day-to-day work, your regular day jobs, how do you see this transition flowing? I mean, it's underway. Where is it going? Where are we going to be in 2030? Where are we going to be in 2050? Katherine, why don't we start with you and then Jigar?
I mean, by 2050, I'm going to be really cranky. But, I mean, we have to have done something by 2030, right? I mean, that's what the IPCC report says, is we have to start changing. And it seems like we're starting to get there on the power sector side. That is clear, that utilities are starting to decarbonize. I think there are a lot of other sectors that we need to focus on, whether it's ag, industry, heating, buildings. We're way behind on buildings. There are a lot of things we need to start working on, and the congressman talked about this as well, like how do we get all of this going? So I think by 2030 or 2050, it's all going to depend on what we've decided to do.
Yeah. Jigar.
Well, so I've been working on this a long time, like Katherine has, and we get our wins, tax credit extension here and an extra amount of money at DOE there, and that's all wonderful. But I think when you look at what happened in 2017, when the U.S. Congress tried to overturn the Affordable Care Act, the number of people who came out and just hounded their congressman or congresswoman at at their district, et cetera, was pretty amazing, right? And when you think about what we do, there are a lot of people out there who are pissed off by the fact that the Senate hasn't, extended the Superfund program, right? And they live next to a Superfund site, and there's no money being there to clean it up, and their kids are getting cancer, right? Or there's, so the health impacts of what we do are real, right? I mean, the health impacts of burning fossil fuels, small particulate matter emissions, where you're seeing with these wildfires in California, people having real respiratory issues from those things, right? And so I'm not as smart as the people who are trying to figure out how to move politics in this country. I'm really good at getting iron in the ground and getting, equipment installed and PPAs signed and small permits issued and all that stuff. But, there are people smarter than me that have said, look, if we open this tent and link healthcare with infrastructure investment, with some of these other social safety nets, that you're going to get more and broader interest in passing something. And so I'm happy to take their word for it and see how this plays out. But I do think that from my perspective, this is the largest wealth creation opportunity of our lifetime. And I do think that folks are slow at getting what's fantastic in terms of economic development and good for the health outcomes of their city. Things like, for instance, electric vehicle buses. I mean, today, New York City came out with their data showing that EVs were far cheaper on a cost per mile basis than any of the other vehicles in their fleet. And, you would think mayors in Baltimore and other places would want to save money.
Yeah, I think that's one of the unhidden, or one of the somewhat hidden things about some of the electric vehicles is their cost to run and operate. So if I heard right, there's a combination here of, we need to get a motivation that builds the political will, but we need to do it fairly quickly, because by 2030, a lot of this stuff has to be in place because of the stock turnover that'll take place between 2030, let's say, and 2050. So what's in the way that you think? I know this is an infinite question, but pick 2 or 3 of the key things that really folks here might be thinking about and taking home. Congressman Tonko mentioned a few of the things that he would like them to do to help him, but.
Yeah, I think people used to say, well, you can't see climate change, so people don't really care. People can see it now. They can feel it. They're affected by it every day. So I think people do know about it and do care. I mean, the vast majority of people, no matter what political party they're in, care about this. And so I think the grassroots is already starting to grow. You see all these kids too, and they're making a big difference, I think, globally. So the grassroots are there. The issue is the political will. We need the political will. Now, some states and cities are moving forward because they have leadership that is saying we have to do something now, because the cost of not doing something is so far more expensive than doing something that also creates jobs and has all kinds of ancillary health and other benefits. But there are other structural issues. One is the way our utility system is regulated. So utilities are monopolies in most cases. Most of the time there's not competition. They're highly regulated. They're put in a position where they're not really given room to innovate. Nor are they given room because they're clenching about what is their future going to look like. Oftentimes they don't want others to innovate and bring it to them. So I think the regulatory construct has to completely change. That's a state regulatory issue. But I also think we need to look at, and from Congress's point of view, we need to set big targets, we need to set big goals. When you do that, even if it sounds like it's out of reach, I don't engage in Twitter wars about can we get to 100% renewables or not. It's totally not worth diving into that mess. Let's just start on that path and see how far we can get and how fast we can get. So there are some structural things that need to change. I think the utility construct needs to change. I think we need to make sure we give room for innovators like Jigar and others to really be able to come forward. And we need to have political will.
That's a good list. Jigar, do you concur with that list, or do you see other?
I learned a long time ago just to agree with Catherine. That's
not the way some of the podcasts come along.
Well, no, I think it's mostly me and Stephen that are disagreeing. I think Catherine is always Switzerland on this. The only thing I would add to Catherine is really just that, I think there is this conversation that occurs on a regular basis around how it's our responsibility. I'm not quite sure how to define that term yet, but our responsibility to help the utilities and the regulators and others get there. And I feel no such responsibility. I think that they are all grown men and women, and they should be able to do their own stuff. I don't understand why I have to like help them out. They're multi-billion-dollar companies. I mean, you know, like I remember coming to one of the predecessor events to C2ES. It was at the museum in 2009, and the CEO of Entergy was on stage, I remember, and he was like, if you guys send us a clear signal, we will do whatever you tell us to do. And I just think that's complete crap. You know, that's not how this place works. Every one of us has stakeholders, and it's about which stakeholders we choose to listen to, right? There are lots of people within the utility companies in New Orleans, God bless those people after the hurricane down there, who wanted to rebuild smarter and who wanted to rebuild with much lower carbon emissions, and they missed that opportunity, and now they're playing catch up, and it's a lot more expensive, right? And our technologies are ready, and New Orleans is ready, and you know, Louisiana's ready, but like, it's just one of those things where I can do what I do, right? Which is basically, you know, seek to educate everybody about where everything's going and where all the money's coming from and who's trained on how to do the work and all that. But I just think the utilities in general, they have to lead this on their own. You know, one other anecdote I would give you is that my friends at like McKinsey and Deloitte and some of those places, I remember in the 90s, they used to tell me that they were getting $150 million a year from the utility companies to help you know, transition them to the competitive markets. They're getting less than $5 million a year today on Utility 2.0 consulting. Like that says everything, right? That we've got to wait for all the Utility 2.0 information to come out of SEPA and their 51st state effort and other efforts. The utilities themselves are not spending 30, 40 million bucks per utility to figure out how to transform their shareholder base and their asset base.
But so I want to push back on one little thing here, which is, like, let's take Hawaii as an example. And Hawaii is moving to 100% renewables for the most part because they cannot afford the fuel that they have to import, right? So renewables, they have a vast resource there. They can manage it. And the electric utility there has really been difficult for them. So they would put an integrated resource plan and the commission would say, nope, that's not good enough. And they'd do another one, that's not good enough. And they tried to figure out, all right, so what do we need to do? So they went to NREL, they looked at, can we actually interconnect? They were not connecting homes that had solar already on the rooftop because they thought they had too much. And people there are paying $500 a month for their electric bills. Like, that's not insignificant. And they're like, I have solar, but it's not connected. So HECO decided we're going to do an experiment at NREL, which is great. This is a national lab that is the purpose for them being there. I used to work at NREL, so I'm a big fan. But so they tested, like, can we actually manage this? Yes, they can. They use smart inverters, they use storage, they can interconnect all of that solar and is not an issue for their system. Yeah. So that learning helped get them to the point where they can continue to connect. They've now are looking at the staff report just issued performance-based rates that will still allow the utility to make a rate of return, but based on different metrics. And I feel like that's where we're going to end up having to go. We're not all Hawaii, but if we look at it that way, if we look at it as how do we change the metrics and how do we incentivize, so the utility is still able to make a living, and maybe they won't do it right the first couple of times, we can help them along and help us get there.
Hawaii is a state of mind. No, but look, I agree with you. But that being said, I mean, if the people of Wyoming want to keep high-priced generation going, you know, and the utility was actively involved with the state legislature to get that passed, and now people's electricity bills go up as a result, and we come in and actually take some of those guys off grid because now you can actually build a microgrid for less than 9 cents a kilowatt hour, well then, you know, like, I'm not going to feel bad about that.
Well, Wyoming just passed some of the strictest methane regulations, so they're doing other things.
A lot of stuff going on out there. So, you know, one of my questions, well, first of all, just to continue Hawaii for a minute, I don't think there's anybody here from Hawaii. Maybe there is. I can't. Do you think their rates are going to go down when they go to 100% renewable?
Yeah. Yes, they don't have to pay for fuel.
Yeah.
Why wouldn't they? Yeah.
So then you wonder, how does it? What's the confusion? You know, this is sort of your point. Why can't they just get it done? So.
Well, and it's not just the rates that they're going to go down, right? I mean, remember, you know, as a society, what we've allowed to happen is that, as the middle class has started to, really just decline in this country, we've filled those dollars with government dollars and corporate dollars, right? And so there's a lot of people out there saying there's not enough money sloshing around in the community for me and to get me back to middle class, and my kids aren't going to be middle class, et cetera. When you switch Hawaii to full electrification, we're going to start, everyone's going to drive electric vehicles, right? All that fuel is currently being imported to the island, right? If we can generate that power on the island, that's economic development with good paying jobs on the island. And those folks are now going to be able to have a larger economy in Hawaii that supports more people, right? And so it's a, beneficial cycle.
Another example that we can take from Hawaii is that because they set goals, they have really become a hub of innovation. They have the Elemental Accelerator there, the Navy is pitching in. I mean, they are really generating a lot of really cool innovation that then they can export to the rest of the states. And I think that can carry over to the US government. When we have regulation, if we have certainty of regulation and goals and targets, that just incentivizes innovation. And we can come up with it. The US is the innovator of the world.
Yeah, this was one of the questions I wanted to dig a little bit on. I mean, first of all, thank you guys for that little discussion of Hawaii. It is a little microcosm, and I think we're starting to watch some of this kind of innovation start to creep into recovery in Puerto Rico as well. So it's island states or island communities have a very different and sometimes unique opportunities. But moving away from the island states, although I can visualize myself there now.
It's been a long winter.
It's been a long winter. Albeit it was really hot summer in the southern hemisphere, so the global temperatures are still going up. But nonetheless, we hear this word innovation. You just used it. You worked at NREL. It's a hotbed there of people thinking about innovation. Sometimes when I hear leaders talk about innovation, it's almost as if there's an assumption that it's going to happen by spontaneous combustion. We just need innovation. And you just mentioned one thing, Katherine, sometimes a regulation that creates certainty stimulates innovation. There's probably a lot of different things that stimulate innovation, including, jobs and capitalistic thinking of profits and new markets. And so what's the secret sauce of mix that really can accelerate innovation? Why don't we start with you on this one, Jigar?
Well, for these particular sectors, the question is, what's the purpose of innovation? What are we trying to get done? And I think if we're talking today about decarbonization, I think then that's a certain specific kind of innovation that's different from maybe other innovation that the utilities and others pursue on a regular basis. To me, I get triggered a lot by innovation just because, I think that, Bjorn Lomborg and Bill Gates and now Varun Sivaram and others are using innovation as a way not to do anything. And what they're really secretly saying is, the current technologies that we have today are not worth deploying, and we need a new set of technologies before it's worth deploying. And so I hate that stuff. But to the extent that, we're all rational people, in a rational sort of framework, you would deploy at scale the solutions that are ready to do that. You would support a lot of private sector innovation, which is generally, I would say, incremental improvements to the existing technology, right? You're making solar panels more productive, wind, higher capacity factors, lithium-ion batteries, more dense, et cetera, right? And then you have early stage innovation, which is largely fed by the government because particularly in the electric utility industry, it's a very long process. It's not like you come up with something new and people say, yeah, here's $1 trillion. You get something new and then you have a pilot, then you have another pilot, and you have a bigger pilot, then 15 years later, you might actually really deploy something at scale. And so, I think the government has to play a big role in innovation and continuing that thread of technology so we have something 15 years from now.
So what I find interesting is I do a lot of work with the World Economic Forum, so I work with people all over the world on a variety of issues that were assigned. I've done future of energy, future of electricity, and now I'm the co-chair of the Future of Advanced Energy Technology Council. And we all sat down about 6 months ago, and these are super duper innovators from all over the world. And we said, all right, to get to an energy transition, and that's really looking to 2030. Like, what are we going to have by 2030 that we need to have out the door? We spent about a half a day talking about what are all these innovations that are coming forward. At the end, we said, we have what we need, or we're going to have what we need by then. So what we need to do now is to figure out what are the gaps, what are the problems we need to solve that we can solve quickly, and how do we do this with a sense of urgency and really get these out the door much, much faster than we are now, so that by 2030 we are very well positioned. So I feel like innovation doesn't have to mean it's in the future. It can be now, it can be incremental, it can also be just solving some of those gnarly issues that we have now that by 2030 we will have completely resolved.
Yeah, I think you mentioned regulation, Jigar, you mentioned government investment. Private sector obviously is also investing in innovation. As most technology companies, if I become narrow-minded in how I define that, the traditional ones, let's say like Apple or Google, they put a substantial percentage of their annual budget into research and development, and so they live on innovation. Others not so much. They live on pilots, perhaps. So is this a place for a really structured public-private partnership where you pick a goal? You mentioned the goals, and you get more strategic investment in government research and development and companion input from the private sector.
Yeah, so when California set their goal for energy storage several years ago, energy storage had just come out of being like a science club. I mean, it wasn't being deployed at all. They set that goal. There are over 200 companies in California. There's an entire ecosystem building energy storage systems. They built an energy storage system within 6 months that took the place of Aliso Canyon gas storage facility. I mean, it does, by setting that goal, it brought people to the table. It also did a very important thing, which was lower the risk for the utilities. It said to the utilities, you can do this, we know you can, put out an RFP and see who comes. Well, believe it or not, more than they could even handle came to the table. And so I think de-risking it for utilities and setting those goals are key for state programs.
Yeah, and I think on the utility side, I mean, they've shown an ability to figure out how to get access to innovation, right? I mean, whether it's through funding EPRI or whether it's through EIP, which has several the utilities that are the LPs in the venture capital fund or other things. I think the big thing, though, the utilities just have to really grapple with is that, look, I think the 4 Ds are coming. Now I have to remember what they are, but democratization of energy, I think, is humming, right? People want choice, right? I think the decentralization is coming, right? And that just seems to be easier than permitting and building multi-billion-dollar infrastructure, right? I think digitization is coming, right? So that's like, the real-time load, all the other pieces. And then the last one, decarbonization, right, is coming, right? And so I think those are coming, right? And I think if the utilities wanted to get in front of them, they would actually propose legislation. I'll give you a couple of examples. Like, one thing I would do if I was a utility is I would say to the federal government, look, we want, pick a number, I think it's like $300 billion for weatherization and all of that work, right? And we'll put up half and you guys put up half, right? And so we'll rate base our half and you guys basically provide grants for the other half, right? And they can, when they do that, put $10,000 per home in there. There's roughly 4.5 million homes, I think, that get access to utility sort of forgiveness programs and support programs and that kind of stuff. So those are the ones I think you'd focus on. And you'd put in DERs, and so you'd make sure that all the refrigerators and water heaters and other things that you'd put in would be IP addressable and be able to controlled. And so those are things the utility could do tomorrow, right? And then there's a lot of innovation that would actually that's currently on the sidelines that would come into that deployment, right? And, I think on the electric vehicle side as well, I think one of the things the utility companies are really struggling with is they all want to rate base the charging infrastructure, which is great, but ultimately that's not actually where the market's going, right? So I think the utilities are struggling with the level of innovation and change in the auto market and how to keep up with it, right? I mean, when you look at where this is going, it's all going with like Fair.com and some of those folks, right? Where, we're moving away from personal car ownership, right? What Fair.com is basically saying is, you tell us how long you want to pay for that car. You want to pay for it on a 7-month lease? Great, we'll give you a 7-month lease, and then they just price it for you, right? And a lot of millennials are going that way because they don't want to get locked into one thing. GM on the other hand has Maven, where you can take a different car every week, right? And the utility companies are saying, wait a second, like, what are we doing here? And I'll give you on EVs, right? There's let's call it 100,000 EVs that are sitting out there right now that no one's driving. Right, they're like off lease. They're Nissan Leafs. They have 70-mile ranges. They're like $7,000-8,000. The utility companies could buy them all and say, look, we're going to now start renting them weekly and monthly to people. And guess what? One of the biggest markets right now for these vehicles are poor people who have to get to work, who are getting screwed over by the used car dealerships in across the country, right? They're paying over $900 a month. You could give them a car for $450 and, make it electric. So I just think there's a lot of models where the utilities are the right group by which all of this stuff should get deployed, but they're just not leading on that. And I think the private sector will separately do it, and then the utilities will be missing out on that chance to do it.
Some third parties will sort of come in and occupy these spaces.
CarMax will do it. It's not hard for CarMax to do it. I mean, CarMax will do it on this side, and then somebody else, ICF or Franklin Energy or Clear Result. I mean, I think Clear Result just got bought by TPG Rise, right? So Clear Result could do it, right? Like it's one of those things where I just think that there's a moment where they can just seize the opportunity, and they're playing a little slow.
Yeah, they have regulatory barriers as well, and so, but this gets to what I think, Catherine, were bringing up earlier, transforming
they
that.
may not want to. I mean, they're still going to sell kilowatt hours if you have more electrification. So in some ways, it's better to let other people take it on and figure that out. I think there is some figuring out. And some utilities want to be more a part of it than others, and I think that's fine. Some of them might just want to be wires companies.
So obviously, much of this economic aspects of this, Jigar, you talked about health at the beginning of this conversation, and what's the goal? Is the goal decarbonization, or is it and so if you can, I think the public is starting to cobble this stuff together, that decarbonization is needed, but it also will improve public health. I can have maybe a better set of tools that are cheaper, whether it's a car or different kinds of appliances in my house, or different ways to get around. And I think consumers are starting to see this a little bit, particularly, and I know this sounds extremely biased. I'm an old guy and I think this way, but nonetheless, younger people tend to think about it more than perhaps most of people in my generation. So, but what's going to be needed to really accelerate that, in addition to some kind of government push, is going to be the mobilization of capital. And so what would, if you guys were advising, I hate to use the word venture capitalists, but people who are looking to invest, how would you have them think of it? I don't want you to give away a trade secret here or something, but I mean, what would you propose their approach would be to dealing with this transition, which is underway, which needs to be accelerated, and there's an economic opportunity here?
So I think of this, I'm going to turn this over to you, but I think of this as like venture is really different from I want the pension funds to be investing. That's where you're going to get acceleration. Venture is there to get, try experiments, right? So we want like the big banks, we want the big players to be investing. That's where you're going to get scale.
Yeah, I mean, the big players, we are fortunate that we have a lot of pension funds and sovereign wealth funds who've invested in us precisely to accelerate deployment. Look, I think this has always been a game that involves governments, right? So the notion that there's anything libertarian about this is crazy. So I think the real question is, what policy tools do we have, and which ones do we want to replicate, and how do we want to replicate it, right? So like, we're today the largest, owner of anaerobic digesters for food waste, right? And, as many people know, there's a big waste problem in this country. We make 130 million tons of food waste a year, but separately, all the plastics that we used to send to China are no longer being recycled as of this week. And so, people are trying to figure out what to do with them. So, and there's technologies for all of it, right? And I think one of the policy mechanisms that we have, which I think I just think for whatever reason, people just, have this aversion to it is, when you look at a renewable portfolio standard, when the first PPAs were being signed for wind and solar, they were above wholesale market prices, right? I mean, and we deliberately, because I wrote the one in Maryland, we deliberately made the compliance really, really low in the first 5 or 7 years, because we knew that our costs would be lower 7 years later. And so the bulk of the megawatts are coming in the tail end, with deadlines of like 2022, 2023, something like that. And they're all going to come in below wholesale price now, right? And so they're actually going to reduce costs overall. And that model can be done across the board, right? So whether you're doing electric vehicles or whether you're doing renewable natural gas, right? The gas companies could all say, I want to have 1% of my, MMBTUs be renewable natural gas, and I'm going to be the counterparty to the food waste digesters, and I'll deal with all the RINs from the federal government and all the LCFS credits from the state of California and whatever acronym comes out that week, right? I'll deal with all that because I've got 100 regulatory lawyers that know how to do that stuff, right? And so I'll just give you guys a bankable contract and, take care of business, right? And the same thing's true with, and a lot of it really helps folks in their community, right? Think about the hog waste. Folks who have had real problems with, unlined lagoons and all sorts of EPA violations. And, there's, I forgot what the stat is now, but it's like every 500 hogs produces a barrel of oil equivalent of like renewable natural gas a year. And there's like 5 million of them just in North Carolina alone. And so, you're talking about a huge opportunity, right? And so these policy mechanisms where you blend some of the early development and the above market costs with the broader thing, it's less than a 1% increase to everybody, but you actually get all this economic development pull through, and then, then folks like me are ready to go, and we're happy to fund all the first projects and get the EPCs lined up and the insurance companies and all the other things.
I somehow knew we would get to hogs. I really did. I want to get a couple of questions from the audience.
Sure.
If they don't have an opportunity on your podcast to call in. Right? So I think we have microphones. We're not allowed to see any of you.
Yeah, the lights are pretty bright.
Ooh, there you are.
Is there a hand? There's one. That hand just needs a microphone. There you go.
Hi, good. Hi, good morning. Aileen Nowlin, Environmental Defense Funds. We do a lot of work at the intersection of health and climate change, and I'd like to pick up on the theme of health you've introduced here. And I'm curious, is there some element of being able to show health impacts, perhaps quantify, that actually makes the kind of projects you're talking about more bankable for investors? Or is it more of a political tool that just increases perhaps engagement and support before a key vote, for example? Or is it perhaps both?
It's measurable. So yesterday, I think the World Environmental Outlook just came out, and they tracked from 2015, I think 9 million deaths worldwide from climate change, climate change related causes. And that's a lot to do with fossil fuels. So it is measurable. I think you have to set up the metrics in order. You have to have metrics that can then be monetized for investors to get interested. But I definitely don't see this as necessarily, it's a messaging and a narrative tool. I wouldn't say it's necessarily a political tool.
Yeah, well, I just saw Governor Hogan come in. Welcome. I think it's a responsibility of governments to figure out the health piece of it, right? Like we can certainly work with governments to justify policy based on health outcomes for the broader population and savings. So like, as you know better than I do. In 2008, 2009, the National Academy of Sciences was, strongly asked by the Congress to do the study around, how much Medicare and other sort of expenses we're spending on fossil fuel, burning related healthcare expenses, and it was in the billions. It was like $50 to $70 billion a year in government expenditures for health impacts that were coming from fossil fuel burning, right? So I think if the US Congress then wants to use that number as a way to justify the savings because it may be spending more money out of this pocket but saving money out of this pocket, then I think that's an absolutely great thing. I think we also brought it up just from a politics point of view. Decarbonization is something that we all, as Katherine suggested, are seeing all too closely now with hurricane intensities and other things. And obviously no one weather event is tied to climate change, but the severity of the season is tied to climate change. And so I do think that in and of itself may not be enough to bring people over, but the fact that there are, mosquitoes and other things now that are living, farther north, our winters aren't cold enough to actually kill them all off. And so now you have worse summers, et cetera, and you get health impacts from that. I do think people are affected by that.
All right, well, I think, as you just mentioned, the governor's here with us, and we're going to cut ourselves off here a little bit so the governor can get up here. I know there's a trip to Annapolis in a couple more minutes, so you got any final points you want to make?
Yeah, the one thing I just want us all to keep in mind, because everybody here is part of the solution and we all have really great ideas that we want to implement, but one thing we cannot forget is that we need to bring everybody along on the transition. There are so many people right now that are getting left behind that we need to think about. And maybe not everybody gets a job installing solar, but we still have to make sure that communities are taken care of. And I think that's in Maryland, that is everywhere. And I think all of us can work together to make sure, whether it's from a health or a jobs perspective, that we bring everybody along.
The thing I would say is that I think I'm accused often, probably rightfully so, of being hard on utility companies. And the reason I'm hard on them is because I, as a taxpayer and as a citizen of the United States, granted to the utility company a monopoly license to be able to do the work that they need to do on behalf of the public. So to people who've been granted so much, I have high expectations, right? And so I am not, against the utility company. I don't think that, whatnot. I actually think that decarbonization efforts should be led by the utility companies. But yes, I have very high expectations, and I really do believe that the utility industry actually has a very bright future if it decides to lead in this area and use the tools that it has at its disposal to really socialize a lot of these costs in a way that brings in private sector capital and brings in the best and the brightest talent, which the utility has always been amazing at drawing out. So.
Well, thank you both for joining us. I think one of the takeaways here, combining all that, is that everybody needs to see their own future in a decarbonized world and with the opportunities as well as the benefits. So thank you both.
Thank you. Thank you all.
We'll exit out this way.
Thanks.